Get ready to take a flamethrower to the official narrative and learn what the elites don't want you to know. You're listening to The Tom Woods Show.
Hey everybody, Tom Woods here. It is episode 2568 of The Tom Woods Show. And we're once again joined by Dan McCarthy, who is so many things. He is not merely a syndicated columnist. I don't simply read his pieces in the New York Post. I read them all over the place, including the New York Times, the day after the most recent presidential election. He is vice president for the Collegiate Network at the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and he is editor of Modern Age. And he's just, it seems like he's everywhere. You were in a debate recently that I'm very interested in talking about, but all the same, welcome back, Dan McCarthy.
Thanks, Tom. Always a delight to join you.
All right. So so the last time you were on, it was pre-election. So I think we've all kind of done our analysis episodes and articles, but there is so much to mine here. I mean, really, I think it's such an interesting presidential election because there's so much going on here. There's so much of interest in it. And so first, let's start with this. In the days leading up to, and maybe the weeks leading up to the election, a lot of people on social media were sharing electoral maps, and they would color in blue or red how they thought each state was going to go. And I never did that, but a lot of people, it was just for fun, predicting what they thought would happen. And but there was, I think, an assumption among a lot of people that although Trump definitely had a good chance of winning, and the Democrats had good reason to be concerned, it could well turn out to be another case of he wins the Electoral College, but he doesn't win the popular vote. And so because the Electoral College is held in some suspicion by some people, there would always still be some pall over his presidency that it's not entirely legitimate because he didn't win the popular vote. But then he did win the popular vote. So going into this, I know you didn't release one of those maps in terms of a prediction, but in your mind, did you predict that it was, let's say, better than 50% chance that he would win the popular vote too?
Well, about 2 weeks before the election, a friend of mine who's a much better analyst of these things than I am mentioned on stage in a debate I was having with him, not a debate, but a discussion rather, that he thought Donald Trump had a very good shot at winning the popular vote. And I'd seen other people speculate on that possibility, but until I heard this friend of mine whose judgment I really trust say it, I'd never really, looked closely at the possibility myself. Once he said it, I then thought, you know what, that's very, very possible. I'm not certain he's going to win the popular vote, but I think that's a very live possibility. And I was even worried that you might get a nightmare scenario where Trump wins the popular vote but loses the Electoral College, which would really be, confusing and disastrous for people.
And it turns out, so if we're thinking of the swing states as being, and you correct me if any of these are wrong, but Nevada, Arizona, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and were we thinking of Georgia as a swing state?
That's right. It had never been before, but then in 2020, it defected to Joe Biden. And so this year it was thought of as a swing state.
This year was, okay, so that's 7. And I don't know, there weren't, yes, obviously there were a lot of people who, for reasons of wishful thinking, had Donald Trump winning all 7. Others, through genuine analysis, concluded that he would win all 7. But doggone it, he won all 7. And I don't even have a question there, but that's incredible to me.
Well, what you see is an effect that's kind of similar to herding in the polls, right? So if somebody's doing well enough that they're going to win one battleground state, chances are that the same feelings that are driving them to success there are also going to drive them to success in the other battleground states as well, unless there's really something that, totally distinguishes one battleground from another. And that certainly wasn't the case. At a minimum, I thought that you were dealing with 2 blocks of battleground states. You had more or less Sunbelt states like Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, arguably even North Carolina. And then you had these Rust Belt states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And I thought there was a chance that you might get a split there. And it was kind of, not that I have any hair left, but it was hair raising because if Harris had been able to hold on to all of the Rust Belt states, and keep Pennsylvania out of the Trump column, there's a very good chance she would have won the election. But of course, it turns out that what you got was really a wave. You got a wave of Trump sweeping all of the battleground states, and also Trump had coattails. And the reason why a lot of these Republicans including Dave McCormick in Pennsylvania, are getting pulled across the finish line and are winning Senate seats is thanks to Donald Trump. It's the opposite of what, so many neocons have been saying for so long, namely that Donald Trump, even if he could somehow win an election by a technicality with the Electoral College, that Donald Trump was, poison at the ballot box, and Donald Trump would have a negative effect on other Republican races. The opposite is true. Donald Trump is far more powerful, more popular than the Republican Party is.
I won't give everything away, Dan, but I'll just say that the night of the election, I was out for dinner with Jenna at Commander's Palace in New Orleans. And what a wonderful place and a great meal. And I had my phone off because I just couldn't take it anymore. And also because for whatever reason, I started that day with a bad feeling about how things might go. And as longtime listeners to this podcast will know, I've made clear I just couldn't imagine a Harris victory. It just would have been so demoralizing. So I just couldn't even look. I was just going to have a nice dinner with my wife. The polls had closed, and now the chips will fall where they may, but I just couldn't bear to look. But after a while, it was eating away at me, Dan. Eating away. What's going on? So I said to her, text Dan McCarthy. Ask him, just give it to me straight. Summarize what's going on so I don't have to go through cascades of headlines. And so a couple of times you sent us little briefings during the night. I'll tell you, that prevented me from having a heart attack. So I'm grateful to you. I'm grateful to you for that. I want to ask you, though, a completely unrelated thing. You did a debate recently on which of the two candidates you would more want to have get the 3 a.m. phone call. But there's some some international catastrophe, and it's the 3 a.m. phone call. Which one do you think has the temperament that you would prefer getting that call? And so you did this debate, and you took Donald Trump's side. And I was telling Jenna about this, and I said I could imagine there being a skeptical audience there because they probably think he is puffed up with a lot of bravado, and he would and he would behave in a way that was reckless. And she responded immediately, said, that's not the vibe I get from him at all. I think he would handle that very well. So somehow he got through to her on this. How did you try to get through to the audience making that argument?
Yeah, so this was a debate I did at the Center for the National Interest, who are the publishers of the National Interest magazine, which, among other things, is very famous for 30 years ago, almost 40 years ago now, having published Francis Fukuyama's essay, The End of History. So it was actually co-founded by Irving Kristol, who, of course, was the godfather of neoconservatism, although in more recent decades, the National Interest has been more of a realist magazine. Nevertheless, it attracts to its debates a foreign policy establishment kind of crowd for the most part, as well as prestigious journalists. So there were some folks from newspapers that controversially did not endorse Kamala Harris in the audience when I was giving this talk. The newspapers did not endorse, but of course we know where most of the reporters and editors were coming from. And then also folks from embassies and other think tanks and nonprofits. So very much what you would imagine as being the DC foreign policy elite gathering to hear this debate. And of course, I definitely had no illusions going in about how popular Donald Trump would be or an argument in favor of Trump. That said, however, two things were interesting to me. First of all, and this kind of speaks to the psychology of things, right? But my debate partner was Paul Glastris, who's the editor of the Washington Monthly. And if you were to judge based on the relative degrees of optimism and the relative degrees of confidence, even though I wasn't sure at that point, this is about 5 days before the election, even though I wasn't sure that Donald Trump was going to win, nevertheless, my case was very optimistic and positive and had this sense that, the tide is turning. And I think Glastris felt rather besieged, and that kind of came through in the things he said. So first of all, I thought that was interesting, just the different sort of tones. I will say that the audience, despite coming from institutions that would certainly be very skeptical of Trump, they were not unduly hostile or difficult to deal with. On the contrary, actually, I thought the audience was very curious and very interested in the things I had to say, precisely because they know. I think a lot of them knew that they were going to have to deal with Donald Trump, in a second term, and they want to hear kind of what an intelligent case for him, in their language and the idioms that they understand, how that would sound and how they would respond to it themselves. And then also, Glastris, my debate partner, he had this very interesting sort of disturbing. He didn't mean it quite as harshly as it sounds, but he was basically arguing that Donald Trump supporters are just like the Serbs who supported Slobodan Milosevic in the 1990s when Serbia was involved in these very nasty ethnic wars in the Balkans. And, Glastras had been a reporter in the Balkans during that era, so that's why he was using that as a touchstone. I thought it was, he wasn't trying to quite call Trump supporters deplorables. He was trying to make a case about, Milosevic capitalizing on resentments or on people who felt economically betrayed. But I thought it was a very revealing analogy that he drew because, of course, what did America do to the Serbs who supported Milosevic? Well, we bombed them. And what would, the likes of Kamala Harris and Hillary Clinton like to do to deplorable Americans who support Donald Trump? Well, they'd probably like to have NATO bomb them, too.
Well, indeed. So was that debate Oxford style or was it just informal?
No, it was pretty informal. And in fact, even though the explicit topic was the 3 a.m. phone call, which, by the way, I'd totally forgotten that actually originates with the Hillary Clinton campaign back in 2008. This was the argument that she used against Barack Obama in the Democratic primaries. She said, do you want this inexperienced Illinois senator who's anti-war, sort of anti-war at least, to take the 3 a.m. phone call? Or do you want Secretary, she wasn't yet Secretary of State, but the, experienced Senator Hillary Clinton, who's connected, of course, to her husband and his administration. So I thought it was very interesting that analogy that imagery backfired in 2008. And it really didn't succeed any better for, the Clinton side of things, or now the sort of Biden-Harris side of things in 2020.
The tricky thing about recording
2024, I should say.
Right.
Time gets away from you.
Right, it does. Keeping track of all these Trump elections. We're recording 2 days before this comes out, and these are events that are happening very quickly. So I don't want to talk about potential candidates for various cabinet positions because the issue may be moot by the time people hear this. I will say that that Lee Zeldin was just named to be EPA commissioner, and I have no knowledge of what his qualifications for that might be, but I remember thinking he was given the impossibility of being a Republican in New York. I remember thinking of him as a seemingly impressive guy, so I thought that was a reasonably solid pick. But in general, it's interesting to see that people who think of themselves as being big Donald Trump supporters are part of a very vocal group and a very large group on social media now, demanding no neocons and saying down with the warmongers. And this really is something new, Dan, because I remember the Ron Paul days when I tried to talk to these exact people, and I would use language like that, and it was like they just couldn't understand me at all.
And of course, another big change is that Elon Musk is one of these voices online and in fact in person, talking to Donald Trump and telling him not to hire neocons. Now, Musk may not be as well informed about who the neocons are as the listeners to your podcast are, although perhaps, who knows, we may very well have Elon tuning in. But in any case, I think he is a force for good in terms of advising Donald Trump, as indeed are people like Tucker Carlson, Donald Trump Jr., Florida Congressman Matt Gaetz. There's a lot of people who have Trump's ear who I think are giving him the right kind of help and advice.
Folks, the more the politicians fiddle with American health care and health insurance, the worse it gets. You know it and I know it. You look at American health insurance and it's an absolute mess. That's no secret. It's expensive and frustrating, and it shows no signs of getting any better. So you think surely there has to be some alternative out there. Well, that's why Crowd Health was created. It's not health insurance. It's a better way to pay for health care through crowdfunding. Crowd Health is doing things differently. For $175 for an individual or $575 for a family of 4 or more, you'll get access to a community of people who are willing to help out in the event of an emergency. You'll get access to telemedicine visits, discounted prescriptions, and so much more, and without doctors' networks getting in the way. Let Crowd Health help with your healthcare needs. Get started today for just $99 per month for your first 3 months. Go to joincrowdhealth.com and use code WOODS. Crowd Health is not insurance. Learn more at joincrowdhealth.com. That's joincrowdhealth.com, and remember code WOODS. So, what do you think a second non-consecutive Trump term looks like in very, very broad strokes?
Well, I think immigration is clearly going to get fixed, and there's going to be a very strong push to penalize companies that are that are hiring illegal immigrants, which has always been, by the way, the real hangup here, because a lot of businesses that, in fact, finance Republican congressmen and that have their thumbs in the pie of the Republican Party, whenever there would be a crackdown on their employment of illegals, they would turn around and go crying to a Republican member of Congress or a Republican governor and say, "Hey, call off these, raids. We need to have, we want to continue supporting you, Mr. Nice Republican. We can't have these bad Republicans cracking down on us." I think Trump is not going to be sensitive to those kinds of wails from, wails in perhaps both sense, wails of lament, but also wails in the sense of the giant sea creatures that are also an image of a massive donor or a massive spender. Anyway, so I think immigration will get cleaned up, and clearly Trump has a big mandate to do that. Foreign policy, Trump is inheriting a much more volatile and difficult situation now than he inherited even in 2017. And 2017 was bad enough. We still had the Afghan war then, of course. Now we have U.S. Support for Ukraine, and it's really U.S. support that is keeping Ukraine in that war right now with Russia. Similarly, the U.S. is also financing and arming Israel in its war with Hamas. Both of those, of course, present all kinds of difficulties at all kinds of levels. I think, however, even before Trump takes office, Trump had said he was going to get peace in at least one of those areas, I think, with Russia and Ukraine, even before he took office. That's, probably a little optimistic. But I do think that all the parties in these conflicts, Hamas, Israel, not just Hamas, but actually the wider, network of people who are supported by Iran in particular. But Iran, Israel, Russia, Ukraine, all of them have, an off-ramp here. They have a chance to either declare victory or cut their losses and call it a day. If they don't do that, then Trump is going to be very upset with them. And, Trump is someone who wants to follow a path of peace. He wants to keep America out of these conflicts. But he's also someone who's quite willing to use, large amounts of force, as, one or two Iranians discovered during his first term, if he believes that he needs to send a message to someone. So I would hope that all the parties to these conflicts recognize that this is the golden opportunity, again, either to declare victory or cut your losses. The longer this goes on, the worse it'll be for absolutely everyone.
But domestically, you say that for good reason that immigration is likely to be a major issue over the next 4 years. And we're hearing that we're going to be observing the largest mass deportation effort ever. Does it not seem likely that various judges will attempt to intervene, coming up with some pretext for arguing that the deportation is somehow unconstitutional, and then trying to gum up the works, in effect daring Trump to defy the judges and thereby casting himself as the fascist dictator they all feared he would be?
You've brought up a really interesting point, because the judiciary itself is also not only going to be another battleground in the near future, but it's a battleground right now. So Joe Biden is trying to leave office by filling every single vacancy he possibly can within the judiciary with people who are going to do exactly what you've described, who will try to impede Trump policies on every front, but especially on immigration. In addition to that, there's also now this sort of complicated calculation that arises from the bad example of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. The left, saw Ruth Bader Ginsburg hang around up to a point when, she was too old. She died in office while she was on the court, and allowed Trump to appoint her replacement. Well, now, funnily enough, you've got, desperate Democrats calling on, or at least there's a little, sort of social media campaign to get Sonia Sotomayor, who is not even all that old, but to get Sonia Sotomayor to resign immediately so that Biden can try to push through a young replacement while the Democrats have both the White House and the Senate. Now that's ridiculous, but it shows you what the stakes are right now. Now, obviously, once Trump takes office, Justice Alito and Justice Thomas are both quite old, and both have given indications at various times that they are aware that their time on the bench is not unlimited. So you could very easily have some, battles for Supreme Court nominations coming up in the very near future. And I think it would have to be before the 2026 midterms, because of course you just don't know, if if the Republicans are still going to have the Senate after that point. So all of that then combines with the point you raise about how judges will impede Trump's agenda and what the public reaction to that's going to be, and how, the media did everything they possibly could to call Trump a strongman and a fascist and every other name under the sun. And of course, it completely failed. Trump is more popular now than he was when he won the 2016 election. That's what all of this, sort of hype and hysteria coming from the media has generated. So I could see potentially that it might backfire if you have judges trying to impede Trump's agenda, and if you have the Washington Post and other publications trying to, say, oh, okay, Trump's not just Hitler, he's double, triple Hitler now. I mean, what are they possibly going to say? Where do you go from there, There was an Atlantic headline during the election season that said Trump is Hitler and Stalin and maybe it was Mao as well. They combined everyone into a single article. This was Anne Applebaum, by the way.
Yeah, I saw that.
Desperate characters. So the other thing, too, that's interesting here, I mean, it looks, unfortunately, like Ruben Gallego is going to defeat, Kari Lake for the Senate seat from Arizona. But what's interesting is that some of these Democrats in purple states, in states that Trump won, they've got to think carefully about their future. And Arizona in particular is a kind of, risky state. So some of these Democrats, they might wind up being a little bit more like Kristen Sinema or like, Joe Manchin from West Virginia than you expect right now. And I have absolutely, no real hope for someone like Ruben Gallego. But I do know that self-interest, especially when there's a powerful president who seems to have the public on his side, self-interest is a very powerful incentive for even Democrats to start becoming a little more cooperative with the newly elected president.
Well, that's entirely possible. We'll wait and see. Meanwhile, you on this program said that J.D. Vance would be, of the plausible candidates, the best choice for Trump. He did make that choice. And then early on, I wouldn't say Vance had a rough start because it had nothing to do with him. The media treated him absurdly, but he seems to have nevertheless gotten his bearings. And then the quite late debate with, not debate, I beg your pardon, a podcast appearance with Joe Rogan, I think sealed it that there's nothing weird about this guy. He's obviously normal. He's just the most normal guy in the world, and relatable. I have my disagreements with him, but how do you feel like he ultimately turned out as a pick?
Well, he was a home run, and you kind of, at least my interpretation of the attacks on him when he was first nominated was, this is how we know Trump made the right choice, because the Democrats are desperate to throw any, completely made up dirt and characterizations they can at him. They have no substantive criticisms that voters would actually take seriously. They just want to demonize the guy, ruin his character, call him weird. It was like high school politics. And that level of desperation and sheer malice, the sheer animosity of it, that made me think, you know what? They hate J.D. Vance as much, maybe even more than they hate Donald Trump. And it's because J.D. Vance is so good. So I thought that was a great, sort of mark of honor. They were going after him in that to that extent. On the campaign trail, he did an extremely good job, and he was always, both on message for Donald Trump's, campaign, and also had, the humanity and the capacity to have a normal conversation, which came through in the Joe Rogan interview. So I think, Vance is excellent. He's young, of course, which works in both ways. I mean, it does mean he's got a bit of a learning curve still, but it also means there's just so much, potential there to expand and to become even stronger. And, I think, and what a huge improvement, by the way, Trump-Vance is compared on Trump-Pence, right? Pence was explicitly added to the ticket because they needed a very normie Republican, from the, sort of Bush-era generation, who would, reassure any Republicans who were just not sure what kind of leader Donald Trump would be. Now we know what kind of leader Trump is. We know that he's a better leader than the Republicans could produce, and that, he needs someone who is going to be a kind of heir and a successor who will be true to his, agenda. And J.D. Vance has that. And of course, Vance has, a lot of abilities as a writer and as a speaker, which they're not necessarily stronger than Trump. Trump also, of course, is a kind of genius on the stage. But they are in their own way equal to, and quite capable of addressing even some battlefields, especially with the elite media. That Trump himself, Trump would have a kind of Alexander the Great meets the Gordian knot approach, right? So Alexander the Great encounters one of the greatest puzzles of the ancient world, this knot which had been tied in a way that nobody could possibly be smart enough to unravel the knot. So Alexander the Great just drew his sword and cut right through the knot. That's how Alexander worked, and that's how Donald Trump works. But I think J.D. Vance is someone who could actually succeed in untying that knot. So it's a brilliant pick, and I'm very optimistic.
Now, what about something that a lot of people have been talking about, how the left has responded to this? Now, I have to admit that if Harris had won, I would not be taking the time to say, oh, what did I do wrong to make this happen? I would be saying, well, the nation's been propagandized nonstop for not just 4, but 8 years on this subject. And, we have to start there. I wouldn't be saying my message is wrong, or I'm just admitting I probably wouldn't. But it seems like you do have to explain what went wrong when you had all this money and you had the most sympathetic coverage anybody could possibly ask for. You avoided interviews left and right, and you were basically let off the hook for that. You had the support of every major power center in America, and you still lose. Then I think there does need to be some kind of a reckoning. And so far, it's been, well, I guess the American people are more racist than we thought. And I don't think I'm being unfair. I think the balance of the response has been that way. Or am I being uncharitable?
No, I think you're right. And in fact, maybe I was too charitable. I just today wrote a column about how the response of the Democrats to their defeat here, and like you say, it's an embarrassing defeat because they had basically $1 billion campaign. They had every possible advantage and they blew it. You may recall, in fact, that right before the election, about a week earlier, I'd written a column saying Trump is the underdog. I didn't mean by that Trump was the weaker candidate. I obviously meant that Trump is facing many more hurdles than any Democrat or any opponent could possibly face. And yet, even with the deck stacked against him, Trump not only won but won a sweeping mandate. The Democrats have partly resorted to what you've said. They've resorted to saying the American people themselves must be awful fascist racists if they elected Donald Trump. And in a way, I actually take a lot of joy from seeing Democrats and neocons especially having to come around to that point of view, because for so long these people have never been representative of the American public, but they've always wanted to say, well, the American public is with us and not with Trump, and now they have to eat crow, and it's just delightful to see. And they're so bitter about it, and they really hate their fellow Americans. They always have, to be honest. But now they feel like they should be open about it because democracy itself has betrayed them. But the other thing Democrats have tried to do is to blame it all on Joe Biden. They've said, well, Biden, he was selfish. He should never have run for re-election. And I won't let them off the hook for that because, of course, when Democrats nominated Biden in 2020, they knew how old he was, and they already knew that he was past his prime, and they still nominated him. They nominated him because they realized that Biden was the only person who could possibly take on Donald Trump among all the candidates the Democrats had. And we've now proved that because, of course, Kamala Harris, even with all those advantages, she went down to a dismal defeat. So the Democrats had basically an empty bench in 2020, and they had to get this old retired guy, basically Joe Biden, as the person to, pretend like he was still standing for the Democratic Party of FDR and JFK, or even Bill Clinton, perhaps, when in fact, the Democrats are much more woke and, just a much more revolting party in every way, even compared to what they were, and I'm by no means a fan of FDR or Clinton or even JFK, but the Democrats today are far worse. The idea was that Biden would kind of disguise just how bad they were. And of course, Biden sort of had that role even during Obama, when he was Obama's vice president. So I wrote a column basically saying that the Democrats have been in a perpetual leadership crisis ever since the Obama era, that Obama himself wasn't the success that Democrats make him out to be. And since Obama, they've had no successor, no heir, no one who can carry on and do what Obama did, because nobody else has Obama's charisma, and anyone else who has Obama's agenda is seen as being, a left-wing lunatic and someone to be defeated. So anyway, I think Biden is still the strongest and sanest, of the national Democratic leaders. And the fact that after Biden, it's just going to be an endless series of people like Kamala Harris, that's a damning indictment of the party. And it really shows The Democrats now have to learn to love America again. They have to learn to be nationalists even. They have to learn from Donald Trump the way that Democrats in the early 90s learned from Ronald Reagan to embrace a little bit more of the free market.
Hey, gang, now that I have adult children, what I look forward to most about Thanksgiving and Christmas is just having everyone home together. I've got my daughter Amy coming home 2 weeks ahead of Thanksgiving this year, and we're all thrilled. Family really is at the heart of this time of year. And that is yet another reminder of how important it is to provide for them for even when you're gone, so they can handle the array of expenses they'll have to face as they regroup in your absence. And Policy Genius is the place to go. At Policy Genius, you can compare quotes from America's top insurers side by side for free with no hidden fees. Their licensed support team helps you get what you need fast so you can get on with your life. They answer questions, they handle paperwork, they advocate for you throughout the process. With Policy Genius, you can find life insurance policies that start at just $292 per year for $1 million of coverage. Some options are 100% online and let you avoid unnecessary medical exams. Life insurance is a form of financial planning, and Policy Genius is the country's leading online insurance marketplace. Join thousands of happy Policy Genius customers who left 5-star reviews on Google and Trustpilot. Secure your families tomorrow so you have peace of mind today. Head to policygenius.com or click the link in the description or on the show notes page to get your free life insurance quotes and see how much you could save. That's policygenius.com. Well, what about somebody like Gavin Newsom, though? People point to him and they say he's telegenic, he's well-spoken, although he did clearly lose that debate to Ron DeSantis. But for some reason, the fact that California is a you-know-what hole, at least parts of it. I know it's a beautiful place, but if you live there, you certainly know what I mean. He's done a lot of damage to that state. That we all know that for some reason that doesn't matter. That doesn't mean anything. No one cares. I don't understand that, but it doesn't seem to bother voters. Couldn't he be the person they're looking for?
Well, I think you're wrong about that. I think it does bother voters. I think it bothers the trouble with California, and California shows the problem with a winner-take-all, large state. So the problems that California has now are problems that America could have if it didn't have the Electoral College, where California actually has, I think, even now, the largest number of Republicans of any state in the union. And that's simply because, of course, California is the largest state in the union. But those Republicans happen to be outvoted by Democrats. And so you wind up with one-party control of this extremely large state, and it's suffering the consequences of that, as you've pointed out, that Gavin Newsom has been a disaster. Gavin Newsom is basically strangling the California middle class, and he's strangling the California working class. And that's why, the most advantaged state in the union in terms of its geography, in terms of its climate, is actually losing population now. And it's not because the weather is any less attractive than it used to be. It's because the human environment, led by the government, led by Gavin Newsom, is something that's now actively repelling people and removing population because, it is, again, just so difficult to buy a home, so difficult to start a business, so difficult to be middle class or working class in Gavin Newsom's California. And I think that makes Newsom completely toxic in, presidential elections. I think Newsom, has no chance whatsoever of, winning the White House. Maybe he could win the, Democratic nomination if they have, no one else they feel like is competitive. But I think Newsom is, the bloom is off that rose, and he's not going to be able to restore that. And then Gretchen Whitmer, by the way, to mention the governor of Michigan that was thought of as kind of top tier contender. Maybe, if the Democrats had actually had a primary this year, not the fake primary that Biden wins and then they hand it over to Kamala, but if after Biden was dropping out, they actually had a real primary and had multiple candidates. There was a lot of talk about Newsom, a lot of talk about Whitmer as being, top contenders. But Whitmer also, she went out of her way to really, sacrilegiously offend Catholics by engaging in this sort of pantomime, imitation of, the Holy Communion, feeding a Dorito to a kneeling social influencer. Something like that not only is outrageous in itself, but also it shows you just what bad political instincts, someone like Whitmer ultimately has. And while, she may have prevailed in Michigan for whatever reason, I don't think that kind of, Democrat has a future either. So the Democrats are in deep trouble, again, unless they're able to learn something from Donald Trump, the way that, I really despise Bill Clinton, who was much more far left than people realized. But Clinton was able to bamboozle an awful lot of Americans into believing he was a new kind of moderate Democrat. And I think Democrats after this election are also going to have to try to bamboozle the public into thinking that they are, for stronger borders and that they actually represent some of the same things that Trump represents. The one Democrat on the national stage who potentially, is different from the rest, and I think, his brand is still not one that's going to work for the nation as a whole. But Governor Jared Polis of Colorado is well liked by some libertarians. He is, at least partially supportive of school choice. He, differs, is not as politically correct and woke as a lot of other Democrats. But I think Polis also has, a lot of baggage too. And the very things that libertarians like about Polis are the things that would probably prevent him from getting anywhere in a Democratic presidential primary.
People say that the off-year election, so 2 years from now, tends to not be good news for the party in power. So when we're looking at 2026, is there anything that can be done to minimize the effects of that, apparent reality of American politics? Is there anything that can be done to hold off some kind of the Democrats kind of snapping back a little bit?
Well, I do think that Trump has to factor the probabilities into his calculations for his agenda. So this first year in 2025, Trump will be able to accomplish a lot. He's going to have, the trifecta, full Republican control of the Senate and the House, as well as the White House. In the midterm year, even though he'll still have that trifecta in the year 2026, it's not until November, of course, that we have the elections. Nevertheless, congressmen are going to be extremely skittish and very much focused on their primary campaigns and then the general election campaign, rather than focused on implementing the president's agenda. So 2026 is probably not going to be, a very big year for things that Congress, has to take part in terms of policy. Now, there is something else happening in 2026, though, that I think will alter the usual calculations a bit. 2026 is the semi-quincentennial. There are a couple of different ways to say that, but semi-quincentennial is one of them. It is the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence and basically America, separating itself from Britain and calling itself, an independent country. Which, this is, first of all, I didn't even want to think about what those celebrations were going to be like if Kamala Harris had won. Because even if Harris didn't go full woke, and I think she would have, I think it would have been full, 1619 project. But even if she'd been able to restrain herself a little, or for the sake of, Democrats doing better in the midterms if Kamala were president, even if she tried to be, a little bit more patriotic than you would think, I would still just absolutely dread, that whole year of celebrations being turned into a year of celebration of, basically a antithesis of the real American spirit. Instead, we have Trump, and 2026 really is going to be a celebration of America and, the great achievement of our founding fathers. So that, I think, is going to create a bit of goodwill. And hopefully that's a goodwill that will minimize the losses Republicans might suffer in the 2026 midterms. That said, those midterms are going to be, historically, midterms are always bad for the incumbent president. Usually 6-year midterms, rather, the midterms of a president's second term are worse than the midterms of his first term. There's very little evidence, of course, to see how that works when you have a president serving non-consecutive terms. The only previous example, of course, before this was Grover Cleveland. And it is the fact that Grover Cleveland's second term midterms were worse than his first term midterm. So that's a bad precedent. But again, it's only one precedent, in 250 years of American history. So nobody quite knows, if the midterms in 2026 are going to be standard or going to be like the usual midterms. But I think Trump has to anticipate they might be, in which case he needs to accomplish everything he possibly can in the next 12 months.
I don't want to get you accidentally into an inadvertent institutional civil war or anything, Dan, because I understand your position, but I don't follow much the think tank world, the right of center institutions. So I don't know really where a lot of them have been on Trump. I bet it's a hodgepodge. I know that the current leadership at the Heritage Foundation is sympathetic, but is Trump going to be dealing with a portion of conservatism Inc., like in the intellectual sphere? Not that this is going to bother him that much, but that is still alienated from him even now?
I don't think so. Well, I should sort of divide that into two categories, right? On the one hand, the institutions that really matter are those that already decided to take the Trump message and find the parts in their own agenda that fit with that message, and find basically the institutions that are succeeding on the right today are the ones that recognize that Trump was correct and who have found ways to combine what they were already doing with what Trump wants to do. Heritage is certainly in that category. So is the Claremont Institute. Both of them, the Claremont Institute in particular, was really out in front and recognized the potential of Trump much earlier than most other people did. This is back in 2015, 2016. And I could tell you a story. Actually, I don't want to go into the details because they would be a little perhaps even controversial now. But I will say that just recently I heard the president of one of these think tanks invoke basically a thinker as paleo as Murray Rothbard. It wasn't Rothbard himself, but it was a very paleo thinker in an address to a large room full of scholars. So you'd be surprised how successful a lot of Rothbardian and paleo-conservative thought has been in seeping into places that you would never have guessed would be sympathetic 20 years ago. So those institutions, I think, are going to be very strong, especially Heritage and Claremont. AEI has basically, I think, written off any attempt to have influence on the American right, or at least, for the next several years here. They may try to recalibrate a little bit, but I think they now see themselves the way Cato used to see themselves during like the George W. Bush years, as being, they have their ideology, they have their, sort of technocratic ideas, but they're not necessarily well aligned with the Republican Party. Now, Cato itself, I worry a lot about, because Cato has some good foreign policy people, but of course, Cato also has, these hangups about Trump, especially on immigration and trade, which really have made Cato very ineffective in recent years and are going to make it even less effective in the future if they're not careful. And then you have, institutions. I was very shocked actually to see that National Review, right before the election, published a print issue where two separate pieces, one of them being the unsigned editorial, said the best that we can possibly hope for is to have divided government. And we have to have a Republican Senate with a leader like Mitch McConnell. They understood that McConnell was stepping down as leader, but they said we have to have a leader just like Mitch McConnell replace him. This is what National Review in the year of our Lord 2024 thought would be the best, that National Review could hope for, their version of conservatism. I wanted to vomit when I read that. I could not believe it. I understand, they published the Against Trump issue back in 2016. And I know some of the internal dynamics that led to that, so I don't necessarily blame every person at the magazine for that 2016 issue. But in 2014, you would have thought that some lessons would have been learned. And at least as far as the print magazine goes, that wasn't the case. I was just astonished and repulsed. Now, I do think...
Well, you mean 2024. You said 2014.
2024, yes.
Yeah.
Again,
I'm sure everyone knew that, but just to clarify.
Yes. So 2016, they had the Against Trump issue. 2024, this year they had the best that we could hope for is divided government with Mitch McConnell in charge of the Senate, or someone just like Mitch. And of course, when you say divided government and the Republicans have the Senate, what are you implying about the presidential election? I mean, this does not take a genius to figure out. I could not even understand this from a business perspective. You lead a conservative magazine, and this is what you've come to. It just shocks me. I will say, I mean, there are other people, especially in the online side of National Review, who are much more pro-Trump, and I think that there's a younger generation which is at least divided. It's not wholly anti-Trump, but it just shocks me that you still have Goldbergism, basically the ideology of Jonah Goldberg, persisting at some of these institutions. And at this point, all that does is it marginalizes them. It doesn't cause Trump any inconvenience.
Well, one last thing, and then I'll let you go. And I'm actually not asking this to be snarky. I'm legitimately wondering, and I know you don't have a specific answer, but what happens to Liz Cheney now? She gambled it all on one outcome. It did not occur. Well, is she a Democrat forever now, or what
I think she probably will be, actually. I mean, what's to prevent that? I mean, it's not as if, the thing that you and I have known about the neocons all along, and it's something that, you have to know people's character and know the way their philosophy works as a whole. You can't just look at individual statements they make. So what you and I and other people who understand the neocons have known from the beginning is that whenever they say that they're socially conservative and anti-abortion and, opposed to gay marriage or anything else, whenever they claim to have these other principles, they really don't. In fact, they are fundamentally about their own prestige and power, and also about the wars, of course, and the power of the national security state. Now, when it comes to war and foreign policy, when it comes to, getting the U.S. into as many conflicts as possible, which is a sad thing to say, but it really is the truth. When it comes to the national security apparatus, all of that is now owned by the Democratic Party. The Democrats, in the Kamala Harris years, they, lost whatever shred of, former anti-war character they previously had, which is why you see people like Tulsi Gabbard and RFK Jr. coming around and supporting Donald Trump. So that was the best trade that's ever been made, is to exchange Liz Cheney and the Cheney dynasty for RFK Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard. So I think, what's to stop? In fact, I could even see Liz Cheney running for office in the future as a Democrat, right? I mean, you've seen so many examples of these, Republican grifters and neocons who turn around and they get, some of them some of them worked for Trump and then they betrayed him. And then they got, nice media assignments on The View and other well-paid, MSNBC and mainstream media gigs. So of course that's what the Cheneys are going to do. They're going to have the same kind of golden parachute that people like David Frum have had all along. And I'm just happy to see them outside of the Republican Party and outside of the sort of broader conservative movement. Because and it's also, I do have to say, I take so much pleasure in seeing people I respect who actually are on the left for principled reasons, or are not just these horrible sort of Kamala Harris types, but actual sort of Bernie Sanders leftists who recognize that the Democrats have been invaded by the neocons. And not only are they opposed to the neocons in principle, but they also say, wait a minute, the neocons have already destroyed one of the two major parties in this century. Now they're going to do it to the other one as well. So, I'm happy to see that happen.
Well, aren't we all? Dan McCarthy, thank you so much for talking to me today. Also, I want to, of course, remind people modernagejournal.com is where you should go to check out Modern Age, which Dan edits, and also at Tory Anarchist on Twitter, or if you're one of those who has surrendered to the new name X, but at Tory Anarchist. Dan is very much worth following there also. So once again, Dan, thank you very much.
Thanks, Tom.
And thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Make yourself and those you love less vulnerable to the regime, both mentally and physically. Get more forbidden information at tomsfreebooks.com and be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you listen. See you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.